Hello, everyone, and welcome to you all. My name is Josh Edelman. I'm reader in drama and contemporary performance at the Manchester Metropolitan University, and I am one of the co-Is on the project, the economic, social, and cultural impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on independent art workers in the United Kingdom, or as we call it, freelancers in the dark. This has been a 20-month project funded by the UKRI Economic and Social Research Council, COVID-19 Rapid Response Initiative, and it is coming to an official close at the end of this month. So we wanted to take this opportunity to share what we'd found in our research with the UK theatre community and to kickstart a conversation about the state and the future of freelancers in the field that we're all part of and that we all love. We're not here to present you with the last word on freelancers. We couldn't do that even if we wanted to, and we don't. We're here to share our ideas, to share what we found with you, and get your feedback and to get your ideas, which will be hugely valuable to us going forward. We do hope you'll leave the discussions over the next 2 days with some insights, with some perspectives, and with some fire about these issues that you haven't had before. Now, this project comes out of our interest as researchers and as artists in the future of the theatre field in the UK, as an art form, as a cultural practice, and as a place to work. Even before the pandemic, we were talking about the ways in which changes in arts policy could have a long-term effect on how freelance workers in the UK theatre planned, organized, and lived out their careers. When the pandemic hit, though, we knew that this work had taken on a new urgency. To put it mildly, the pandemic upended everything. Production stopped, plans were disrupted, people's expectations for the future were destroyed and remade. Relationships between freelancers and companies got rewritten. Funding agencies reevaluated their roles. And along the way, new practices and ways of working that it seemed impossible just months before had emerged. Now, this project is looking to study the effects of those disruptions. Now, we know there have been quite a few other projects looking at the pandemic and the effect it's had on freelancers, especially in the immediate term. And responding to this first hit, that kind of urgent need to keep freelancers safe and supported during the crisis, is something that other projects, such as Freelancers Make Theatre Work, have done very well. You can find some of them in our exhibition, by the way. As academics, though, we've taken a different perspective. Our work focused on the legacy of the pandemic, on the long-term effects that it's having, and that it may have on theatre freelancers and their working life. What has it done to folks' plans, expectations, and sense of their place in the field? What has it done to their relationships to their employers, to their funders, to their colleagues, and to their audiences? And what has it meant for their sense of their place in society, what it means to be an artist in the contemporary UK? Now, these are some of the questions that this project has explored, and they're what we hope to discuss with you today and tomorrow. Now, the final report of our findings will be published on about the 31st of March next week, and will be available to download from our website, freelancersinthedark.com. But today and tomorrow, we don't want to just read those findings out to you. We very much hope that this will be a set of discussions and not just us monologuing. So we've invited a wide variety of voices from the UK theatre world to join us, to comment on and discuss our findings and debate the issues raised by them. And this work is for you, and it's important to us that it becomes a useful tool for you when you're making the sort of decisions that will shape the future of your careers, your art, and the field. Now, we'd love if you'd like to live tweet about anything that you hear today and tomorrow. Please use that hashtag FreelancersITD, which I believe is in the chat. I'm just going to open that to find out. Or not, if my computer's not going to let me. Yes, it is. I want to give a big thank you to our hosts today and tomorrow, Manchester Metropolitan University and the University of Essex, as well as Queen's University Belfast, our partner on the project. Of course, our thanks go to our funder, UK Research Innovations Economic and Social Science Research Council, as well as our wonderful tech team helping today and tomorrow to hope everything works well. And thanks to Kill the Cat Theatre for offering online performances of The House never wins tomorrow after the conference. If you haven't signed up yet, please do. There still is some time. There are some tickets available. They're free, and it sounds really quite exciting. But most centrally, we want to offer our thanks to the many freelancers who've worked with us over the 20 months of this project in interviews and surveys, in focus groups and creative workshops. We've tried to respect and understand your opinions and reflect them back in a clear and useful way. We work for you and the project is yours, and we're very grateful. Now, just a few technical things before we get started. We hope you found your way around this wonderful early 90s video game style gather town in which we're hosting our conference. The idea is that it's as much like a real in-person conference as you can get in 2D land, with all the chance meetings and millings about and the chance to chat with people in the bar. Go into a room to hear a talk, you click the X and then it'll give you the link. Walk over to a poster to look at it. If you go up to someone, you can start talking with them. And if you sit down at a table with them, you'll be in a private conversation that only the people at that table can hear. We've got the conference schedule posted all over and a really interesting exhibition room up top with more information about lots of other projects. We haven't actually figured out a way to physically give you coffee yet, but we are working on it. So for the rest of this opening session, I wanted to give a chance for my fellow members of the research team to introduce themselves and give you a brief overview of the methods, findings, and central themes of our research project. So Ali, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Josh. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Ali Fitzgibbon, and I'm a senior lecturer at Queen's University, Belfast. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the survey we conducted. So this strand of our study, and it's the one that produced the statistical information we will be referring to in our report, was a voluntary anonymous survey of theatre freelancers. And the value of a survey as a mixed method survey, which means we used qualitative and quantitative questions, is that it gives a snapshot and a quantitative data of how theatre freelancers were experiencing and responding to the effects of COVID-19 during a key period of late 2020 into early 2021. It also gives us a rich range of qualitative responses we've used throughout the report. So we got kind of comments and feedback and answers to questions that richly illustrated these experiences. The survey was developed by Josh Edelman, who you've just heard from, and Laura Harris at Manchester Metropolitan University and me at Queen's University Belfast, and hosted on a platform called Online Surveys through JISC. It opened on the 27th of November 2020 and it closed on the 19th of March 2021. And in total, 397 freelancers responded. The majority of the responses were based in England, but we received a balanced number of responses from Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and also a broad geographical spread within that. A diverse range of theatre occupations were represented in the responses, and as part of the survey, we invited respondents to give us demographic detail on their gender, nationality, age, and ethnicity, and all of these questions were voluntary. While the survey was open, we were able to target key regions or groups that were underrepresented. So we monitored the responses to ensure that we were as inclusive as possible. And while relative to some of the other surveys conducted by sector networks, the response is quite small, the richness of the data has given us a lot of valuable knowledge. The survey had a total of 34 questions, split between quantitative, tick box, multiple choice options, and invitations to voluntarily add more qualitative information in the form of questions like, would you like to tell us a bit more? This meant someone could complete it very quickly with just the quantitative data, or they could take longer to add further information or thoughts that they'd had. As part of the development period, we tested our questions with freelancers and we made adjustments to improve the completion time and response rate. Most respondents gave us additional information, with some questions prompting quite long responses, and the average completion time was 30 minutes. We conducted the survey at a time when it was becoming clear that there had been multiple surveys of this group, and a certain amount of consultation or survey fatigue had kicked in. We tried, as a result, to orient our questions towards areas that we didn't see examined in existing data. We focused on freelancers' expectations for the future and what their long-term thinking might be. We also tried to understand their social, political, and civic sense of belonging, and how this was influenced by their relationships with other parts of the sector and by governments, their relationships with governments. Another factor in this survey was the unanticipated new variant spread. So while the survey was open, the rise of the Delta variant meant that the freelancers' lives we were trying to capture were also changing. So time itself and the changing attitudes over time is something that we will be returning to in more detail. But through the survey and alongside the other data, we can see how theatre freelancers' emotional relationship to their work and the sector evolved as each new wave of restrictions and reopenings came along. So now I'm going to pass over to Holly Maples, who is the project lead of this project at University of Essex, to talk about the interviews. Holly.
Hi, my name is Holly Maples. I am a senior lecturer at East 15 School of Acting, University of Essex, and the primary investigator on the project, as Ali mentioned. And I'm going to talk about the one-on-one interviews that we conducted as part of our study. So when we conceived this project, one of the big things that we were looking at was mixed methods of ways to gather the thoughts and feelings, hopes and dreams and experiences of freelancers over the pandemic. So we wanted to complement the survey with one-on-one interviews as well as focus group interviews, which Dr. Rowson is going to discuss after this. The one-on-one interviews occurred since the autumn of 2020 through to the spring of 2021. I conducted 135 interviews, 80 of which were in the autumn from September through November, and then an additional 55 in the spring from March till April. Originally, when we conceived of this, we thought the autumn would be enough for the project, but the rise of the Delta variant meant that there were so many changes, and the new lockdown over Christmas of 2020 to 2021 made for a need for further study. The interviews were particularly kind of looking at not only the thoughts and feelings and experiences of freelancers over COVID, but how this compared to their experiences in the industry pre-COVID. So the first half of the interview focused primarily on their experiences as freelancers in the industry. And then we moved on to how that has changed and what has happened to them since March 2020. There were a wide range of people involved in the interviews. The age ranges were from 20 to 84. And the experiences people had depended on the disciplines that they were involved in, the regions they were from. And it allowed for a really kind of broad scope of the different issues facing different parts of the sector. For example, we spoke to an access officer from Norfolk who discussed how the roles of live captioning were sometimes felt as external to the other works and kind of conditions of the buildings that she worked in. And she was discussing how the rise of the digital over COVID allowed for certain levels of access, particularly in live caption, but only for some people, where a lot of officers were left out in the cold. We also talked to people who had worked as front of house staff for a number of various organizations in London and talked about the different levels of support and lack thereof they received over COVID, as well as actors' experience, theater makers, directors, set designers, lighting designers, technicians, and other members of the industry. This allowed for a broad scope of experiences. And we particularly were interested in the not only sense of being left out of a lot of the support networks that were in place over COVID, but how this had a kind of ongoing effect on their sense of value, their sense of the feeling of how the theater industry is valued in society and by the government, as well as the types of tactics that they used for resilience to remain involved and in the profession over COVID. So I will move on to James, who's going to discuss the focus groups now, and then we'll go on to the micro commissions. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. Yes, so my name is James Rowson. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Essex, working on the Freelancers in the Dark project. And I'm going to talk to you right now about another part of our mixed method approach with freelancers in the dark, which was the gathering of qualitative data through a series of focus groups that we ran between March and November last year, 2021. And these focus groups, in compliance with the strict social distancing laws that were in place when we started conducting them, were carried out over Zoom and took place with a group of between 4 to 6 freelancers. And on average, they lasted about 1 hour and took a semi-structured approach with a few questions being given to our participants, but what we were really aiming to do was to sort of start a dialogue amongst themselves and sort of see how they engage with each other and what conversations came out of this meeting point. And within the framework of these sessions, we designed our questions to be open to interpretation. So they were framed to invite participants to articulate their own lived experiences of navigating both localized and discipline-related challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United Kingdom, and reflect on their own outlook on the theatre industry and how it has shifted since the start of the pandemic in the UK since March 2020. And the participatory and communal nature of conducting focus group interviews with theatre workers was particularly generative due to the often collaborative nature of theatre workers. So, as I was saying before, our participants regularly fed off of each other, and interviewing them in an interactive, dialogic environment often produced really generative results for our study. So our focus groups were divided up between 2 categories, and the first were conducted with a regional focus, with interviews held with professional theatre workers across the UK, including in London, Manchester, South Wales, North Wales, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Belfast, and many more locations. And these regional focus groups aim to capture how theatre freelancers' experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic have varied regionally across the whole of the UK, as well as the regional differences between the levels of support that they have received and the relationships with theatre buildings in their area. And the differences between the more regional and the metropolitan theatre has been reconceptualized during the pandemic, as theatre workers have taken to using digital platforms to engage and create multi-regional work with their peers at both a national and international level, with far greater prevalence than before. So in doing so with our questions, we aim to explore how the pandemic has shifted theatre workers' connection to their local area and their ability to create work there, and ask if freelancers have been provided with support within their local area, both from theatre buildings and organisations and local policymakers. So the second round of our focus groups, which we conducted in September and October and November of last year, looked at specific disciplines within the industry and included focus groups with actors, directors, and playwrights. And in these, we sought to better understand the challenges presented by the pandemic for specific groups of freelancers within the industry, asking how their ways of working had changed during the pandemic and whether they had looked to other artistic mediums for work opportunities during the pandemic, and if they were confident for the future of the industry as well as their craft. And what was especially exciting about these focus groups was that they were able to capture the enlivened and articulate responses of our participants and draw new light on how the pandemic has affected the working practices of the freelance theatre workforce throughout 2021. Our findings suggest organisation and public bodies need to consider strategies that move beyond thinking at a national level and instead focus on building collaborative relationships at local levels. And in doing so, this will allow policy to be built around the understanding of the manifold anxieties and challenges that have been articulated by freelancers in different regions. So in addition, our regional focus groups also demonstrated that there's a really integral and arguably overlooked regional dynamic to how the pandemic has affected the working practices of theatre freelancers. So while existing interviews and survey of the pandemic and its consequences on theatre workers have primarily had a national focus, our participants' responses in the focus groups provided us with a crucial opportunity to explore the significance of geographical variations in the COVID-19 crisis in the context of the UK theatre ecosystem. Although coming from broad theatrical backgrounds that included directors, writers, actors, designers, the participants in our regional focus groups tended to have an experience of work and a working knowledge of local and national funding streams and support. This reflected that, in part, our focus groups asked our participants to discuss regional issues involving their relationships with local and national government and funding sources. So our participants and their responses during our focus groups suggest that while the vast network of freelance theatre workers in the UK have found new and diverse ways of peer-to-peer support and advocacy during the pandemic, there are still wide regional disparities to how supported and connected freelancers feel in their local area. This can be seen by how freelancers have included feeling detached from both communities and the wider theatre ecology where they live, as well as highlighting the lack of local support networks for theatre workers during the pandemic. In addition, our findings in the focus group suggest that there's a strong desire amongst freelancers to produce more localized work that engages in close dialogue and engagement with local communities. The pandemic has provided a motivation for theatre artists to rethink the way local voices are heard and articulated on stage. And it also shows that they're finding new ways to explore how alternative discourses and narratives can be heard in a post-COVID or a mid-pandemic theatre in the UK. However, support and guidance from local organisation and public bodies, as we found during our focus groups, is vital for freelancers to be able to engage in these localised community projects and productions. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Holly, who's going to talk about the creative micro commissions that we have, and then I think I'm going to join in as well and also chat about that. So Holly, I'm handing back over to you.
Great, thank you so much, James. So just to speak on the micro commissions, basically we thought as we were conducting our interviews and focus groups, I remember speaking to one artist in Cornwall who was saying what would be really great after all of these lockdowns and all of this separation was us to get together as freelancers and creatively respond and express what had happened to us over this period. So the micro commissions were developed to create a kind of gathering that was a creative focus group, allowing us to artistically respond to the thoughts and dreams, to the themes that had come up over the interviews, to the experiences we'd had, so that collectively we could use the medium of the arts, the medium of theater, to express and reflect on the experiences we've had over the pandemic, as well as the kind of rise of activism and feelings of support networks that were so important over COVID for many freelancers who felt left out or left in the dark of many of the different types of support being available for the industry, as well as in the discussions on the theatre industry itself. So our creative micro commissions took place across the UK in October and November of 2021. We got in there right before Omicron hit. The micro commissions were held at 6 locations in the UK, including London, Plymouth, Birmingham, Edinburgh, and Cardiff and Newcastle. They included 3-hour virtual workshops first, where we discussed the various themes that were coming up from the interviews that we were focusing on in the micro commissions, and then had 2 days in the studio, where in groups of 4, freelancers were able to creatively express and develop devised pieces off of the themes coming from our interview data. So at the end of the second day, participants shared scratch performances of the creative content generated, and then we had a further discussion of what this revealed to us about our experiences and where we wanted to go from here. Across the locations, we worked with a range of creative freelancers, including writers, directors, theater makers, actors, dancers, and comic artists, from those relatively new to the industry to those with decades of experience within it. There were a mixture of specialists in the area such as physical theater, visual arts, comedy, as well as performance art, all bringing their own perspectives, skills, and approaches to the commissions. In groups of 4, the participants were asked for one of the 6 themes to explore in their creative devised pieces: advocacy, transformation, giving voice, identity, empowerment, and collaboration. These prompts were all significant themes that had emerged in the interviews, focus groups, and surveys. They were deliberately broad to allow the freelancers to respond with autonomy and imagination. As a result, the focus and design of each set of workshops differed as the freelancers brought their own artistic style and processes into the studio. We also found that in the different regions across the country, people expressed themselves in different ways and had different priorities and issues coming from the work that they created in their community. They were a really empowering and exciting moment for us because we felt that there was something about the shared ownership of the creative micro-commissions that allowed the research to be co-created, the artistic process to celebrate and honor freelancers themselves and the various types of knowledge that they can create and that they have in the meaning making through the artistic process itself. I'll pass over to James in case he has further information to say, but just to note that there were three of us who were facilitating and working with this, were Alexandra Young, James Rowson, and myself.
Thanks, Holly. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to talk about a few of the sort of, I think the really exciting things that I noticed and picked out when we were conducting these creative micro commissions. And the first of this was just a sense of excitement and enthusiasm of our participants for being able to be in a room and being in a creative environment, physically meeting together and being in a room. For quite a few of our micro commission participants, this was the first time they'd actually created something physically in a room together with their peers in 18 months. A lot of them had just been doing work online, making either working in film, making shows online, working digitally. And for a number of them, this was their first time working together in a room in 18 months. And there was a real tangible sense of excitement amongst our participants that me and Holly and Ali also really fed into, of just having that creative space in the room. What ties into that as well that really came out of these micro commissions is just how important it is for theatre freelancers, how their identity is tied up in their value of being creative artists, of creating work, and how their value and identity is linked to this. And this came out a lot in these micro commissions. Particularly one of the things that came up in our discussions during them was people referenced the government's retrain, reskill, reboot advertisement, which had Fatima, the ballet dancer, who was going to retrain in cyber. This came up a lot and really linked to these ideas of sort of value and identity in being theatre workers and being theatre artists that really came out and seemed a really important notion of the conversations we were having in our micro commissions. Another key thing that a number of our participants really focused on was how the structure of these micro commissions that allowed for a whole session on Zoom and then 2 days during which there was a lot of discussion in the creative process, was how they felt it was able to create dialogues with their peers that they might not have had in a more structured rehearsal process. So we had a number of actors talking about how they really felt like it broke down barriers between them and directors or playwrights that they felt had been established beforehand just within the industry. And they spoke to how they felt that they gave them a better understanding of their directing, playwright, acting peers, and understood better the pressures different people were under within the industry, which I think was a really important thing that also came out of these micro commissions. So yeah, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to pass over to my colleague, Rosie Klitsch, who is going to talk as well now.
Thanks so much, James. So, hi everyone, my name's Rosie Klitsch. I'm a professor at East 15 Acting School, which is part of the University of Essex, where I am the Director of Research for the school and the course lead for a BA in Creative Producing. So I'm going to highlight a few of the overarching themes that came to the fore across our conversations throughout the study. Obviously, there's way too much information to share in the next 8 minutes. And I know James and Holly have already started to unpack some of those findings from the focus groups and the micro commissions. But I'm going to kind of step back a little bit and look at the big kind of key headlines that we will be presenting in much more detail in our written report. And actually that will also be discussed by our panelists and yourselves over the next couple of days. So one of the key themes that arose very early on in our discussions was that many of the issues freelancers were facing during the pandemic had their origins in pre-pandemic times. So while globally the pandemic was undoubtedly a kind of a paradigm changer, for many theatre freelancers, it was felt that the pandemic compounded various already existing problems. So austerity was particularly mentioned by interviewees as having a hugely negative impact on the industry. Regional differences were consistently mentioned as both a pre-COVID and a pandemic concern, as James was just discussing. Many freelancers talked about the hustle that was already a key part of their lives before COVID, describing untenable hours and unsustainable precarity. The hustle of their career was for many freelancers already creating a strain on mental and physical health before the pandemic. For many, the biggest problem faced by the industry was a lack of concern over accessibility for marginalised groups. So when COVID hit and theatres closed, all these pre-existing problems were then compounded, with freelancers experiencing a dramatic acceleration of pre-existing trends, in addition to widespread hardship and disruption as a result of the pandemic. In 2020, the first wave of the pandemic was experienced very differently amongst theatre freelancers. There was undoubtedly widespread financial devastation, the impact of which I'll return to in just a second, but there were also hints of hope that this catastrophe for the industry could actually lead to change that might address some of those pre-pandemic concerns. Some freelancers talked of making the most of the opportunity for reflection as they were able to escape the hustle for the first time, while others talked about using the time to explore new skills. But this sense of hope that was noticeable in the earlier interviews seemed to slowly dissolve. It slowly faded as our study continued. And by the interviews that we were conducting in mid-2021 and later, this positivity had turned to pessimism as hoped for changes became less likely. Interestingly, London-based freelancers were more pessimistic than those in other regions. And I guess this isn't surprising as digital working methods opened up possibilities for those outside the capital, while lockdown essentially eliminated much of what makes London distinctive. During the initial days of the pandemic, the financial impact on freelancers was dramatic and immediate. There was a clear narrative that developed from freelancers around their sense of being left behind and of slipping through the cracks or falling through the gaps when it came to funding and recognition from the government and from emergency support mechanisms. Interviewees expressed disappointment and anger around the rigidity of the funding support. For example, a digital designer from the Southeast described feeling like he had lost 70% of his entire year's worth of work in one day. And that, he said, was really, really scary. Our data shows many respondents feeling worried or fearful about their future in theatre. An overarching theme across all periods of the pandemic was pervasive uncertainty. During the lockdowns, and particularly the early lockdowns, freelancers experienced immense uncertainty as to how and indeed whether they would manage to rebuild their careers. As the pandemic progressed, the seemingly arbitrary nature of which industries were allowed to open when and which weren't furthered feelings of frustration. With the restricted openings in spring 2021, uncertainty entered a new phase, with theatres opening. COVID outbreaks were inevitable, with further financial devastation and work safety concerns for freelancers. This profound and continuous uncertainty affected workers across all areas of the sector, both organisations and freelancers, technical and creative, emerging and established. It was wearing and relentless. Another key theme is that theatre freelancers felt abandoned and isolated, forgotten by the government and unvalued by previous employers. Freelancers felt betrayed by the lack of communication from previous employers, which they said made them feel unvalued and excluded. This lack of communication was acutely felt too in terms of government messaging. In our survey responses, the terms unvalued, ignored, invisible were repeated, expressing an overwhelming dismay that the arts and freelancers in particular were sidelined in government communication. The sense of isolation was a major contributing factor in the drastic impact of the pandemic on theatre freelancers' sense of mental health and well-being. The rise of ill health and burnout was already a factor pre-pandemic. With COVID and the impact of theatre closures, the loss of work and ongoing uncertainty had significant detrimental impact on freelance theatre workers' mental health and well-being. Not only did this damaging uncertainty relate to financial and professional fears, but also one sense of identity, purpose, and value, as James was just discussing. A key tool for combating issues with well-being and mental health for many related to increased forms of community engagement and particularly interaction and support from other freelance workers. Theatre freelancers developed networks of mutual support to build back a sense of camaraderie. In our survey, the most commonly cited source of non-financial support was other theatre freelancers, exceeding even friends and family. These informal networks help to mobilise members of the workforce towards activism and change. As the pandemic developed, we saw great numbers of freelance-led networks and grassroots activism. Powerful movements such as Freelancers Task Force and Freelancers Make Theatre Work aim to actively invoke dialogue with cultural institutions and lobby the government for greater representation. Those who, for various reasons, were hesitant to join these large-scale organisations mobilised at a more localised or discipline-specific community level and set up their own activist networks. Central to this activism was the speed at which conversations could be held across virtual platforms, which leads me to the last theme I just want to briefly mention, which was around the capacity for innovation demonstrated by theatre freelancers as part of the widespread turn to the digital. Freelancers were inventive and resourceful, developing forms of digital and audio-based practice. We saw key changes first in the way that freelancers were connecting with one another in terms of collaborative process and rehearsals, and also really innovative strategies for developing and engaging with new audiences. While some freelancers that we spoke to were wary of the over-reliance on digital platforms and warned against assuming that the digital increases accessibility, others embraced the speed and the reach of digital practice. So on that slightly more positive note, I'm going to end my talk and hand over to Kurt, who is going to talk us through the conclusions of the project and recommendations for moving forward.
Thanks very much, Rosie. And I'll be picking up, obviously, on a lot of what Rosie had to say there about our conclusions and how that feeds into the recommendations that we'd like to propose. My name is Kurt Taroff. I am reader in drama at Queen's University Belfast. I am also the head of school for the School of Arts, English and Languages there. So as Rosie mentioned there, probably the most obvious thing we realized early on was that COVID only brought to the fore already existing precarities and inequalities in the theater world. And the pandemic created hopes that this might be an opportunity for a clean break and that recovering might mean reconsidering aspects of the entire theater industry. And that hope is still out there. I think we're going to spend a lot of the next 2 days talking, especially this afternoon, talking about the ways in which that hope is endangered, but that we have this opportunity that we still need to grasp while we have the chance. So with that in mind, particularly as it pertains to freelancers, this idea of reconsidering the theater industry means reimagining the place of freelancers as an integral part of that industry and ensuring that they're protected and treated with the respect they deserve as one of the key stakeholders in the field. So we're offering some recommendations here that we believe that everyone in the industry should be working toward. These are evolving. The project may be finishing, but the way in which what we have learned might impact upon this reimagining is going to evolve with the changes in the field, which are changing rapidly, as you probably all know. So the first area we looked at that obviously came to the fore early in the pandemic was the question of government support and lobbying, both within the industry and specifically with regard to freelancers. So the first key need is the recognition that we need to increase the strength of lobbying power, again, both for the industry and also freelancers need specific representation in this area. It's difficult to say that there is or may be a difference between what the needs of freelancers and the needs of the field, but certainly we have learned that. And that needs to be recognized. An elimination of, or at least opportunity to opt out of pay as you earn as not accurately reflecting the way earnings of freelancers should be taxed and the way that works over the course of a year. Rethinking social welfare assessments, that became an obvious, it's always a problem, became an obvious problem with the government supports early in the pandemic. Rethinking minimum terms agreements as negotiated by trade unions for freelancers with organizations. Clear and strategic planning for any future disruptions. While we can all, I think, agree that the pandemic came as a shock and none of us were prepared, probably globally to a certain degree, we will no longer have that excuse in the future, and we need to be prepared for this whether it be a pandemic or anything else, an interruption to our working patterns and what we might do if such a thing arises again. We've certainly learned that networks need to be formalized and strengthened. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute with regards to communication, but these networks have formed not only a great social space for freelancers, but also a way to exhibit the power that maybe freelancers didn't know they had before, but hopefully do now. And then the idea that the industry and trade unions that represent freelancers in various forms maybe have not historically been attuned to the specific needs and circumstances of freelancers, and that needs to be recognized and adjusted for. Communication. There probably was no area in which the fault lines of where the theater industry was pre-pandemic and perhaps even early in the pandemic became clearer than with regard to communication in various ways. So there was a great deal of activity early on in terms of freelancers who maybe didn't have all that much contact with each other before, except perhaps in audition rooms or rehearsal rooms or backstage, wherever, coming together and sharing in the misery, for lack of a better term, of the early period of the pandemic, and just finding a place to commiserate, share strategies, share experiences, and we certainly believe that needs to continue. As we move, hopefully, beyond the pandemic, the relationships that were formed through these organizations, these kind of ad hoc freelancer groups, I think will be and should be permanent structures that we need to foster and help lend structure to. But the industry has to do its part as well. The industry must do a better job communicating with the freelancers that make up a significant part of their workforce. Freelancers repeatedly told us that the organizations that did remain in touch, even if it was only to check in, were the ones they felt supported by and wanted to work with most in the future. We'll talk at a number of times in the next day or two about the breakdown of relationships between freelancers and organizations, and the rebuilding of that relationship is really crucial. And dialogue is really key here. Freelancers must be given the opportunity to play key roles in the conversation about how we rebuild the industry, both at the macro level, but also within organizations themselves. And we think we're seeing organizations welcome freelancers into this conversation, but we need to make sure that is the case. The third category of recommendations comes with regard to industry support and funding. We very quickly realized how difficult it was for many people to access pots of funding, and a lot of this has to do with simplifying the structures that provide that funding. So simplification, streamlining of public funding streams, that's essential, and we saw that this is possible in the pandemic as things needed to be sped up in order to make sure people got money in order to live. So if it can be done at all, then surely it can be done post-pandemic as well. We need to make sure that those who are unfamiliar with the vagaries of the grant and funding process are not excluded. Funding applications should be made easier, less labor intensive, and more accessible. I'll come back to that. Micro commissions and microfinancing need to be reviewed as frequently inefficient and unfair. Too much industry time is spent on unpaid labor, particularly in the form of writing unfunded grant applications. To become more equitable, funders need to provide peer-to-peer support. I think this goes for academics as well. We've all found ourselves looking at grant applications that were going to take hours and hours and hours, and that we really didn't know where to begin, or even if we had a sense of how we might go about filling it out, that question of whether or not we were even remotely writing something that any funder would take interest in is just a debilitating feeling of helplessness. So the ability to speak to someone who is familiar with the process and might provide that helping hand would be an enormous help to people who are already struggling with what can be a labyrinthine process. So, and I think the key here is we all agree funding needs to be about the work itself, not about the ability to write the funding application. And this would also allow for greater diversity in funding. We welcome the potential moves towards potential pooling of resources through funds distribution via partners, via delivery partners. Creative development and open artist funding from the Arts Councils and Creative Scotland were particularly well received. These were seen as moves towards artist-based rather than project-based funding, allowing for more flexibility, allowing for projects to change over time, and allowing longer development periods. Micro commissions for organizations rather than artists were also seen as a potentially positive development, helping to grow relationships between artists and organizations over the longer term. Next, mental health and mental well-being. We've all seen how big a problem this is, but it also was clear that this was always a problem and always extremely concerning, but that people had not felt able to talk about it in the past for fear that this would impact their future employment possibilities, that they would come to be seen as a problem. And I think it was very clear that everyone we spoke to agreed that needs to change in the future. So care for mental health issues among theater workers must be clearly available. All stigma removed from those who express such issues in the industry is to be inclusive and open space. Organizations should have available mental health first aiders and other safe and independent points of contact to discuss mental health issues without stigma or any threat of punishment in the near or long term. A big one, which I'm just going to discuss very briefly, is working conditions. Of course, the industry must come to and abide by clear regulations of pay scales and regulations on working hours, sick, holiday, and overtime pay. All job postings must be transparent, consistent, and maintained, kept to what the job posting was. Job requirements must be clearly laid out in all postings. Sixth category, access and inclusion. More funding for the arts in schools in order to begin to level the playing field. Working class theaters found arts education as both a pathway to career and a place to demonstrate their talents and abilities, and also a support to their mental health and well-being. So in this context, cuts to arts education is a clear threat beyond the obvious threat to the field. Theater workers with access needs, sorry, this is a bit of a shift. Theater workers with access needs require more flexible working conditions and contracts. We cannot continue to shut out workers with disabilities and or parenting or caring responsibilities. There must be more access support for BLS and live captioning in theater venues to welcome more diverse audiences as well. And access workers need to be integrated into cultural institutions and organizations, really kind of thinking about this as a whole theater-wide, industry-wide shift. Moving on to diversity, I'm almost there, I promise. Diversity in the theater industry should follow an aesthetics of access guideline and should be woven into the fabric of theater organizations, not just an add-on. There must be more diversity in technical staff, artistic, management, and backstage roles. This is particularly necessary at leadership level in order to foster systemic change. We've seen moves in this direction, certainly before the pandemic, but we cannot allow the pandemic to arrest progress that has really just begun. Respondents from marginalized groups in our interviews felt that arts organizations and companies want diversity on the stage, but not necessarily in the rehearsal room, which remains clearly following British white middle-class norms of behavior and social etiquette. So more diversity within and especially at the top of organizations could help combat this problem. And then finally, to end on the same kind of positive note that Rosie did, speaking of cultural innovation, that the changes that were made during the pandemic, we don't necessarily want, we definitely don't want to become all digital or anything like that, but to learn from the creativity and innovation that occurred during the pandemic, both in terms of integrating some of those practices into existing theater practice, but also to realize what we can do when faced with that kind of pressure to create new, interesting, innovative work, flexible approaches to theater making and broadening theater audiences, and that we continue to expand the use of unconventional theater spaces, open air performances, and especially direct engagement with communities. And I think you'd see in there that a lot of these recommendations are intertwined, and that's probably not a surprise. All of these issues are things we discussed before the pandemic about ways to expand the reach of theater, and both to different new and different participants in the theater making process, but also to audiences that are broader and more diverse. Those are our recommendations, and I'm sure we will discuss them in detail over these 2 days. So I'm going to hand back to Josh now.
Thank you, Kurt. Thanks very much. We just have a few minutes before we're going to take a quick coffee break before our first panel. Just as a reminder, the schedule for the day, you can see posted all around GatherTown. It's also in the chat. You can see the direct Zoom links if that's easier for you, though you missed the 2D fun. A reminder that we have a session in the bar, our wine reception from 5 p.m. today. Please do join us there. We'll all try to be there and walk up to us and have a chat. But we have just a little bit of time now before we break for our next panel. So if there'll be plenty of time, and we really want to take the next 2 days to discuss not just our specific findings, but the issues that those findings are raising and the recommendations that Kurt just outlined with all of you in a lot of different contexts. But if anybody has a quick question they'd like to ask now, in your Zoom, you will see at the bottom a Q&A function. If you go to that, you can enter a question. If you'd like to ask your question live, you can just type the word live. I can give you a chance just to actually say your question out loud, or you can type it and we can try to respond now. Any questions, any thoughts? Give you plenty of time to think through them over the next few hours, through the day and tomorrow. But if anybody has anything burning question-wise, not on the kitchen. It's the thing about working from home is that you never know when it's burning, if it's a metaphor or not. Oh, and I've been asked to remind folks that unfortunately the wine reception at 5 today is BYOB. So one attendee asked, when will the final report be published?
It'll be published shortly after the end of March 31st. We're just getting it, the kind of design spruced up. So as soon as they send it to us in the first week of April, it will be published, and we'll share that details.
Yes. So yeah, and you can always keep an eye on our website, which is Freelancers in the Dark. and it will be there and we'll give you updates, but as close as possible to the end of the month. A little bit of an admin thing. These panels are being recorded. Holly, do you know whether or not the recordings of these panels are going to be shared on the website?
I think we will share the webinar panels. We're going to keep the discussions with ourselves just for, we're recording those for just research participant, information. So if anybody wants to see what they've done who've attended, we can send that to you.
Yeah.
But the panels will be shared.
And thank you, Holly. That's a really useful distinction as well. We want to make sure that people feel free, especially in the discussions. Each of the panels is going to be followed by a discussion group. You should see on the schedule. Those are not going to be recorded for broadcast, so feel free to speak freely there. That isn't going to go back to anybody. Chatham House rules. No one will know what you've said, but the presentations themselves, yes, will be shared, and the report, of course, will be shared. We have a question about funders. It feels brave to ask funders to change. Any indication how they're responding to this? Relatively well. I mean, I don't know if any of my colleagues want to speak to that. I know that Arts Council England has been in discussion with us about the report. Their research arm is very interested in getting it and responding to it. Does anyone, especially from Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland, want to speak to how funders are responding to this?
Josh?
Yes.
If I can respond, one of the things that's very interesting in the tracing that we did of the different funding supports and things to try and match up with what we were hearing in the interviews and the focus groups and the surveys, is that the funders had to make really, really dramatic changes very quickly. So if you imagine that the 3 arts councils and Creative Scotland in particular have processed more application schemes than at any period in their history, and had to do it at a really rapid pace, it's kind of shown that certain things that were unchangeable have been proven to be changed. So while the detail of some of this report we needed to do this event to know kind of what else we needed to kind of tweak in the report and things like that, while there's a process after this to share the report and discuss it with them, actually some of those things, or what is it that's going to change with funders, actually needs to come as a much more collaborative discussion. So it's become really clear, and it's visible in the report that we're going to present. It's become really clear that actually processes that involve freelancers in the process of designing them are more effective and more productive. And I think the example I would use is if you look at the development of the cultural contract in the Welsh government have adopted, that seems to be coming directly from some of the pressures brought to bear by the cultural freelancers networks in Wales and how they lobbied for a better attention, not just within arts funding, but across different forms of funding like local authority funding. So one would hope that these things could be looked at as examples of new ways of thinking and new ways of doing.
Thank you, Ellie. I mean, I do think there is a thing about the pandemic that we have demonstrated that change is possible. And that it doesn't suddenly become impossible when the pandemic abates. And the idea that is kind of brave or bold. I think let's be brave and bold. Arts policy and arts funding are not things that some magic person does over there. There's something that we're a part of too. We should go, but just one comment I want to read out from Irini Kartsaki, my apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. They say, I think it feels so reassuring and refreshing to hear all of your findings this morning. This has been such a difficult time, and it's brilliant to see people being fully recognized, and also to consider what positive outcomes may have been developed from this hardship. I wanted to read that out, both because it's very positive, but also I think that's something that we heard a lot in our interviews, focus groups, and on the surveys. That this is extraordinarily difficult. It has been extraordinarily difficult, but actually the idea that this is a moment that we can take hope from, and something really new and powerful and different might emerge from it, that sense has also been there. So that's what we're going to be talking about over the rest of the day. I want to give people a chance to have a break. We will pick up in 15 minutes with a panel on freelancer-led support networks in the studio, and then creative changing in uncertain times, theatrical innovation in the pandemic, which will be in the mezzanine. Both of those start at 1:15. Thank you, everyone. I look forward to discussing with everything with you over the next 2 days. Take care.